No drums, no war cries, no charging horses. Start with an auction. The spring of 1476. A muddy field in what is now western Switzerland. Scattered across it is the wreckage of one of the most dazzling and politically ambitious courts in 15th century Europe. Silk tapestries from Flanders, gold-threaded robes, a mobile library, ceremonial silver, jewels catching morning light in ways the men picking through the wreckage had never seen jewels catch light before. Because men like them did not own jewels. They were farmers, mountain fighters, men from valleys where the most valuable thing a family owned was usually a cow. According to several historical accounts, a large diamond connected to Charles, Duke of Burgundy, changed hands that morning for a price that historians would later describe as almost impossible to believe. One version puts it at a few florins. Another says a Swiss soldier sold it to a priest for almost nothing, who sold it again for 3 francs. The details vary by source. What does not vary is the basic shape of what happened. A stone that would eventually pass through the hands of kings and emperors and end up in the Louvre was treated that morning like coloured glass. One account even says a ceremonial hat crusted with gold was bought by a man who planned to use it as a drinking vessel. This is what happens when a world collapses, and none of the people who destroyed it understand the size of what they just did. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not want power. It wants the appearance of power. The ceremony of it, the architecture of it, the way other people look at you when you walk into a room and understand, without being told, that you are not like them. Charles, Duke of Burgundy, had that kind of ambition, and in the middle of the 15th century, he had more resources to feed it than almost anyone else alive. The court of Burgundy in the 1460s and 1470s was something that people travelled from across Europe just to witness. Not to negotiate treaties, not to form alliances, just to see. When Charles received foreign ambassadors, the experience was engineered to be disorienting. The tapestries alone, enormous Flemish works depicting biblical and classical scenes in colours that had no business existing inside a military campaign tent, were worth more than most noble estates in the region. The ceremonial silver took a full team of servants to transport, and another team to arrange. There were musicians who played during meals, and a master of ceremonies whose entire job was to ensure that every greeting, every bow, every seating arrangement communicated exactly the right message about who Charles was and who you were in relation to him. There was a librarian, a man whose sole purpose was to travel with the court and maintain a collection of manuscripts so that Charles could read in the evenings when the day's business was done. In the middle of a military campaign, in a tent. This was not a court. This was a declaration. And it was expensive. Extraordinarily. Almost incomprehensibly expensive. Maintaining the spectacle of Burgundian power required constant revenue, constant expansion, and constant demonstration that the machine was working. The moment you stopped expanding was the moment you started looking smaller than you were. And for Charles, looking smaller than he was represented an existential threat to the project he had inherited and intended to complete. Burgundy in 1476 occupied one of the strangest political positions on the map of Europe. It was not France. Though it sat along France's eastern border, and the Valois dukes who built it had deep roots in French noble culture. It was not the Holy Roman Empire. Though it controlled territories that overlapped with imperial lands, and Charles maintained complicated relationships with the Habsburg rulers to his east. It existed somewhere between those two giants. A patchwork of duchies and counties stretching from the lowlands of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands down through Burgundy proper and into the borderlands near Switzerland. Held together not by a single ancient crown, but by the personal will and relentless campaigning of 3 generations of Valois dukes. His great-grandfather had started the project. His grandfather had expanded it. His father Philip, known to his contemporaries as Philip the Good, had made the Burgundian court the most celebrated in Europe and added territory through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic marriage that the other powers watched with a mixture of admiration and growing alarm. Philip had turned a regional duchy into something that looked, from the outside, like a state in the process of becoming a kingdom. What he had not done was finish the process. He had left that to Charles, along with the debts, the obligations, the enemies, and the expectations that came with having gone so far without completing the journey. Charles had inherited both the prize and the bill. He wanted to finish what they started, a kingdom with a real crown, the kind that other kings recognized without being asked to, borders that appeared on maps without footnotes. He wanted chancelleries in Paris and Vienna and Rome to write the word Burgundy the way they wrote France or England, as a permanent fact rather than a temporary description of territories held by a particularly ambitious duke. To get there, he needed an army unlike anything his neighbours had seen, and he built one. What Charles constructed was one of the most organised, professionally staffed, and well-funded military forces in Western Europe in the 15th century, not a feudal levy. The seasonal kind of army that medieval lords assembled in spring and dismissed in autumn because the men had fields to tend and oaths to different lords pulling them in different directions. Charles paid his soldiers wages, fixed contracts, year-round employment. He recruited specialists from Italy, England, and the German states, men who did nothing but fight and who expected to be paid whether there was a battle that week or not. His heavy cavalry, the gendarmes, were the centrepiece of this force. Armoured men on armoured horses, trained extensively, equipped at enormous expense, representing the peak of military technology as the 15th century understood it. When a column of Burgundian gendarmes formed up and began to move, the assumption shared by nearly every military commander in Europe was that you did not stand in front of it. You either matched it with cavalry of your own, or you found a way to avoid it entirely. Charles also had artillery, which most of his contemporaries were still treating as a novelty. He had infantry on fixed salaries. He had a command structure that ran on documentation and hierarchy, rather than the shifting personal loyalties that made feudal armies so unreliable. What he had built looked less like a medieval army, and more like a prototype of what European armies would become over the following 2 centuries. By the standards of his era, this was extraordinary. It was also, in a way that Charles never allowed himself to fully understand, deeply brittle. The problem with building a machine so impressive that you begin believing it cannot fail is that you stop preparing for the possibility that it might. You stop asking questions that might reveal its weaknesses. You start reading evidence through the lens of what you already believe. And when the evidence points the wrong way, you find reasons to discount it rather than reasons to adjust. The surviving record suggests Charles knew what the Swiss were capable of before grandson. At the Battle of Héricourt in 1474, 2 full years before the morning that concerns us, a Swiss allied force had beaten a Burgundian army in open field. The pattern of his subsequent decisions suggests he understood the threat and chose to proceed anyway. Not because he was reckless, but because the political situation he had spent years constructing gave him no real alternative. The Swiss Confederation sat in a position that directly threatened his plans for southern expansion. Every month he delayed was a month his enemies used to coordinate against him. Louis XI of France, a king who preferred to fight with money and diplomacy rather than armies, was quietly working to ensure Charles would face pressure on every border simultaneously. The machine Charles had built cost an enormous amount of money to maintain, and expensive machines do not sit still. They justify their existence by moving. This is the difference between a mistake and a trap. A mistake is something you could have avoided with better thinking. A trap is something the logic of your own previous decisions constructed around you. One reasonable choice at a time, until the walls were already there before you noticed them. Charles did not stumble into grandson. He arrived there by following the only path his ambition had left open. The cage was built from his own blueprints. He just had not recognized it as a cage until the morning the Swiss came out of the forest. What was waiting for him on the other side of that morning was not what any professional military analyst of the era would have predicted. Not what the men who delivered it fully understood they were delivering. And not what Charles, even after surviving it, would allow himself to correctly understand for the time he had remaining. That gap between what happened and what the people involved understood about what they had done is the real subject of this story. The battle itself is almost the least important part. In the winter of 1475, a man from the canton of Uri sharpened a pike in his barn. We do not know his name. The sources from this period do not preserve the names of the men in the formations, only the outcomes of the formations themselves. But someone sharpened a pike in a barn that winter, and someone else checked the straps on a leather jerkin that had been worn through 2 previous engagements and would need to hold through 1 more. And someone else said goodbye to a wife and children in a farmhouse near a mountain pass and walked down toward the assembly point where the men of his canton were gathering. These were not soldiers in the sense that Charles's gendarmes were soldiers. They had not been recruited from across Europe and placed on fixed salaries and housed in permanent facilities. They were farmers, craftsmen, and mountain men who had learned to fight the way their fathers had learned to fight, because fighting was one of the things a community in their position needed to know how to do in order to remain a community. The Swiss Confederation in the 1470s was not a nation in any sense that a French or Burgundian diplomat would have recognized. It was a loose alliance of rural cantons and small towns that had been cooperating, arguing, and occasionally fighting each other for roughly a century and a half. There was no king, no hereditary duke with supreme authority over the whole, no capital city where decisions were made and enforced from above. When the Confederation went to war, each canton sent its contingent according to the agreements that bound them together, under leaders chosen from within, fighting alongside men it had trained with and grown up beside. The army that emerged from this arrangement should not have worked. By every principle of military organization that educated Europeans of the 15th century believed in, a force without centralized command, without noble leadership on horseback, without the rigid social hierarchy that was supposed to make armies function, should have dissolved the first time it faced serious pressure. Instead, it became one of the most feared infantry forces in Europe by the 1470s. The core of Swiss battlefield power was the pike formation, long spears, reaching between 15 and 18 feet, held by men trained to move together in dense rectangular blocks. The formation worked by turning the ground in front of it into a place where cavalry could not effectively operate. A horse will not willingly impale itself on a wall of pike points. The rider who tried to force one through a disciplined Swiss formation found himself suddenly stopped, exposed, surrounded. The mathematical advantage of being on horseback inverted completely the moment the charge broke against a formation that did not move. But here is what the military manuals of the period never quite captured. The formation only worked if nobody broke. Think about what that means for the man from Uri, standing in the third rank of a block of several hundred men on a cold morning, unable to see clearly what is happening at the front because there are bodies and weapons between him and whatever is coming. He can hear it. He can feel the vibration through the ground beneath his feet. He can see the men in front of him stiffen and lean forward into their pikes, and everything in his body, every piece of ancient human wiring, is sending the same signal. Move. Find a gap. Do not be standing in front of the thing that is coming. If he moves, the man beside him sees the movement. His wiring fires the same signal. He moves. The man beside him sees 2 people moving and draws the only conclusion the visible evidence supports. The formation does not fail from the front. It fails from the middle. From a cascade of individual decisions that each make complete sense in isolation, and that together produce a collapse no single person chose or intended. Swiss soldiers trained specifically against this, not as an abstract principle, but as a lived physical discipline, repeated until the discipline competed with the wiring. And the conditions that made it work were not tactical. They were social. The man beside you in a Swiss pike formation was the man whose family worked the field on the other side of the fence, whose children played with your children, whose name you would have to carry home if things went wrong and he did not walk back. You could copy the pikes. You could study the formations and train other men to stand in the same configuration. What you could not copy was the reason the formation held, because the reason was not in the tactics. It was in 30 years of living beside the same people in the same valley and understanding, without needing to articulate it, what you owed them when it mattered. Some European rulers who attempted to imitate Swiss-style infantry with different populations found that the imitations performed well in training and broke under pressure in ways the original did not. The tactics transferred. The social foundation did not. because social foundations of that kind are not built in recruiting offices. They grow over generations in specific places, and they cannot be transplanted into a different context by training alone. The Confederation had also been refining its approach through decades of actual combat against opponents, who included Habsburg forces and various regional powers that had tried to exert control over the cantons. By the time of Grandson, they were not an untested force discovering what worked. They were a force that had tested itself and survived and adapted, and arrived at a version of their approach that had been proven against real opposition. Their commanders understood something about the engagement ahead that Charles's commanders may not have fully internalized. The Swiss were not marching to test their formations against Burgundian cavalry under favourable conditions. They were marching because something had happened at the fortress of Grandson that had changed the nature of what this was from a military calculation into something older and considerably less negotiable. The man from Uri finished sharpening his pike. He walked down the mountain toward the assembly point. He did not calculate the odds. The account had already been opened. He was coming to close it. The story of what happened at the fortress of Grandson before the main battle begins with a promise. Not a romantic promise. Not a declaration of loyalty or a vow made in a cathedral with witnesses and ceremony. A military promise. The specific pragmatic kind that made the entire system of siege warfare in medieval Europe function. The promise was simple, and its terms were understood by every commander on every side of every siege across the continent. You fight. You hold as long as you can hold. When holding is no longer possible, you surrender under terms. In exchange for the surrender, your lives are spared and you are allowed to leave. This arrangement existed not because of generosity or idealized chivalry. It existed because without it, every garrison in every fortress would fight to the last man, regardless of circumstances, making sieges vastly more expensive in time and lives for the attacking side. The promise was a mechanism. Both sides maintained it because both sides needed it to function. The moment one side stopped honouring it, the cost of every future siege increased immediately and permanently for everyone. In late February of 1476, the Swiss garrison inside the fortress of Grandson had been holding against the full force of Charles's army. The number that appears repeatedly in Swiss chronicle tradition is 412 men, though as with most specific figures from this period, the count should be understood as an estimate reflecting the chronicler's best knowledge rather than a precisely verified contemporary record. They were heavily outnumbered. They held for days, under pressure that the size of the Burgundian force made ultimately impossible to survive indefinitely. They held anyway. The way men hold positions that cannot be held when they believe that holding has a point, and that the point will be honoured when the holding is done. Eventually the garrison opened negotiations. The terms they received, as the sources described them, included a guarantee of safe conduct. Their lives would be spared. They would be allowed to leave. The precise wording of what was agreed does not survive with complete clarity, and different accounts present slightly different versions of what was promised and by whom. But the broad outline is consistent across the contemporary record. The garrison surrendered on the understanding that the men inside would live. Charles did not honour the agreement. The 412 men of the Grandson garrison were executed after they surrendered. Some were hanged. Others were bound and drowned in the waters of Lake Neuchâtel. The methods are recorded in the sources with a flatness that reads, across 5 centuries, like the writing of people who were setting down facts too large for the emotional vocabulary available to them. Let that number sit for a moment. 412 men. They had done what the system required. They had fought, held as long as they could, and surrendered under the terms the system provided for exactly this situation. They walked out of the fortress on the understanding that they were going to live. And then they were killed. The practical argument for what Charles did is reconstructible from the logic of his situation. He was fighting a campaign against a confederation that would keep producing garrisons willing to hold fortresses for extended periods, as long as those garrisons believed they would survive to go home. A demonstration that resistance had lethal consequences even after surrender might. In the calculation of a commander under pressure, shorten future sieges and reduce the cost of the campaign ahead. This is the kind of reasoning that produces atrocities. Not madness, not cruelty pursued for its own sake, a calculation, made by an intelligent man managing a complicated operation. that a short-term demonstration was worth a specific cost. What his calculation did not include was what the execution would mean to the communities the 412 men came from. Word travelled from Grandson through the Swiss cantons the way news of specific and personal loss travels through communities built on mutual obligation. Vast, with names attached, these were not anonymous soldiers from distant places. They were men whose neighbours were alive and reachable and capable of understanding exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. The news did not arrive as a military dispatch. It arrived as 412 personal devastations landing across farmhouses and town squares and assembly halls throughout the Confederation. The response was not a strategic debate about whether to respond and at what scale. It was the recognition that the Confederation had failed the men it had sent to Grandson and failed the garrison that had held under Swiss protection. And in a structure built entirely on the credibility of mutual obligation, that failure had exactly one acceptable response. What does our protection mean if we do not respond when the people under it are killed after they surrender in good faith? There was no useful answer to that question that did not involve going to Grandson, not because the military odds were obviously favourable, because the alternative was to establish, permanently and visibly, that the Confederation's guarantee was conditional on convenience. And a conditional guarantee was no guarantee at all. It was a suggestion. A confederation held together by suggestions does not remain a confederation. Charles had wanted to make an example. The pattern of what followed suggests he made one. But not the example he had calculated. He had wanted to demonstrate the cost of resistance. Instead, he had activated a different mechanism entirely. The response of a community that understands it has no choice but to act, because the alternative is to become something it cannot recognize as itself. The army that assembled and moved toward the Burgundian position was not motivated by the prospect of tactical victory. The man from Uri standing at the assembly point with the other men of his canton was not there because someone had analysed the odds and determined the Swiss could win. He was there because 412 men had walked out of a fortress expecting to live and had been killed instead. And some of those men had been people whose connection to his own life was close enough to matter in the specific way that only proximity and shared history make things matter. Charles, preparing his position near the lake, was thinking about a campaign. He was thinking about deployment and terrain and the timing of his gendarmes and the position of his artillery. He was applying the considerable intelligence he had spent years developing to the problem of managing a large professional force in the field. The Swiss walking through the forest toward him were not thinking about a campaign. They were settling an account, and the difference between those two states of mind, one force still calculating and one force already decided, is where the Battle of Grandson was actually won and lost. The physical engagement that followed on the morning of March the 2nd was the recording of a verdict that had already been delivered. All that remained was the mourning and what it would do with the distance between an army that had not finished getting ready and a community that had nothing left to decide. The 2nd of March, 1476, began the way most mornings in a large military camp begin. Fires being lit, men moving between tents, the quiet necessary labour of keeping thousands of people fed and organised and oriented toward the day's requirements, the kind of work that consumes most of the hours of most campaigns and leaves almost no trace in the historical record because it is too ordinary to write down. Charles's army had made camp near Grandson after the fall of the fortress. The force assembled there was substantial by any measure of the period. Contemporary sources give varying figures for the total strength, as they always do when counting armies in the field in the 15th century. But the accounts agree that Charles had significantly more men than the Swiss force approaching from the north. He had his gendarmes. He had artillery. He had experienced infantry on fixed wages. He had the organisational depth that distinguished a professional force from anything assembled on seasonal obligation. What he did not have, on the morning of March the 2nd, was time. The Swiss advance came out of the forested high ground to the north, earlier than the Burgundian sentries were prepared to report and respond to. This detail appears in multiple accounts from both sides of the engagement, and it is the hinge on which the entire battle turns. The timing was not accidental. Whether it resulted from deliberate planning or the accumulated instinct of men operating in terrain they understood better than their opponents did, the effect was identical. The Burgundians received warning too late to use it. A 15th century army preparing for engagement was not a simple operation. The gendarmes needed time to saddle and armour their horses, to form into the column configurations that concentrated their shock power, and to move to the forward position where they could be applied effectively. The artillery required positioning and preparation. The infantry formations needed to be organised and directed. Each step required time, and time required warning. And the warning on the morning of March the 2nd arrived after the sequence it was supposed to initiate was already impossible to complete. The Swiss did not provide the sequence. They arrived. Think about what the forward Burgundian positions saw when the Swiss formations came out of the tree line. Not an approaching force visible at long distance, giving time for messengers to run and commanders to issue orders and units to assemble. A wall of men, already formed, already moving, already committed, emerging from cover at a distance that compressed the available response time towards zero. The formation was in motion before the people who needed to respond to it had finished understanding what they were looking at. The men at the front of the Burgundian line were not cowards. They were not poorly trained or poorly equipped. They were men whose preparation for this kind of engagement assumed a sequence of events that was not going to happen. Their trained responses had been built for a battle that began in a recognizable way. By most tactical accounts of the period, this battle was already happening before the standard sequence had a chance to start. Some of the forward units stepped back, not a decision, not a retreat ordered from above, a step, then another. The instinctive response of bodies registering that the thing approaching was not survivable in the current configuration before the mind had finished processing what to do about it. One step back. The man beside him saw the movement. His body made the same registration. The formation began losing its shape at the front. And the shape of a formation at the front is the only information available to the men behind it. What they read was the formation giving way. The cascade that followed is one of the more thoroughly documented examples of how military collapses actually work, as distinct from how they are described in accounts that assign clean causes to outcomes produced by many simultaneous small decisions. No order to retreat was issued at this stage. No commander looked at the situation and concluded the battle was lost. What happened was that individual soldiers and small groups, operating on the information available from their specific position in the formation, made decisions that each made complete sense given what they could see, and that together produced an outcome no single person had chosen or intended. The gendarmes had not completed their deployment. Some were mounted, some were not. The column formation that would have allowed them to function as the concentrated shock force they had been built to be had not fully assembled when the movement backward began. They moved with the withdrawal, not as a formed unit executing a tactical decision, but as individual riders responding to the same visible information that everyone else was responding to. Charles saw what was happening. The correct response of any competent commander in this situation is a controlled withdrawal, pulling the force back to ground where it can reform, stabilise, and return to the engagement on better terms. He ordered the withdrawal. What followed was not controlled. The problem with a withdrawal under pressure is that it requires the men executing it to believe two things simultaneously: that the movement is temporary and purposeful, and that the situation is recoverable and worth recovering. Both of those beliefs were already under strain by the time the order reached the men who needed to act on it. The camp followers, servants, and non-combatants positioned behind the military formations could not see the front of the engagement. They could see armed men moving toward them at increasing speed. They ran, the men behind the main force, who could see the non-combatants running but could not see why, drew the only conclusion the visible evidence supported. They ran as well. The rout completed itself through the same mechanism that had begun the collapse. Individual people making individually reasonable decisions from individually limited information. Each response triggering the next. Each reasonable conclusion feeding into the next, until the accumulated product of all those reasonable individual responses was a total and irreversible dissolution of the army as a functioning unit. No single person had decided this. Every single person had contributed to it. Charles survived. He retreated with portions of his force intact and reached positions of relative safety. He was not captured. He was not killed. What he left behind was everything: the tents, the tapestries, the ceremonial silver, the manuscripts from the travelling library, the complete physical apparatus of the Burgundian court that he had carried on campaign for years as a moving declaration of what Burgundy was and what its duke represented. The jewels, whatever stone would eventually carry the name Sancy Diamond, sitting in the mud by the lake alongside a ceremonial hat and a travelling library and the scattered remnants of a civilization that had been, until that morning, the most elaborately maintained demonstration of political legitimacy in the region. Farmers were already picking through it. The Battle of Grandson lasted, by most accounts, a matter of hours from the moment the Swiss emerged from the forest to the moment the Burgundian position ceased to exist as an organised military force. The most expensive professional army in the region had collapsed before it finished forming up, and in the hours after the collapse, on the field by the lake, the most extraordinary scene was not the military aftermath. It was men who had come down from their mountain cantons in winter to settle an account, standing in the wreckage of a world they had just ended, trying to figure out what any of it was worth. They were farmers. They had no framework for what they were holding. They valued it the only way they knew how. The inventory of what Charles left behind at Grandson is one of the more remarkable artefacts connected to the battle. Not because of what it contains, though what it contains is extraordinary, but because of what its existence reveals about the man who assembled it. You do not bring a librarian on a military campaign because you need books to fight. You bring a librarian because the books need to be present, to be part of the physical environment you carry wherever you go, because their presence is part of the argument you are making about what you are. The argument is that you are not a warlord moving across a landscape with an army. You are a civilization in motion. You carry culture with you the way a capital city carries culture. Not because it is useful in the field, but because leaving it behind would mean admitting that the field is what you actually are. The tapestries made the same argument. So did the silver. So did the ceremonial vestments and the formal dinnerware and the complete apparatus of court ritual that travelled with the army on every campaign. Charles was not being irrational when he assembled this collection and carried it into the field. He was being entirely consistent with his understanding of what he was doing. The demonstration of civilization was the goal. The army was the instrument for protecting the demonstration long enough to make it permanent. What the morning of March the 2nd did was separate the demonstration from the thing it was supposed to demonstrate. The power broke and ran. The objects stayed. When the Swiss came through the Burgundian camp in the hours after the army collapsed, they were moving through the physical residue of a world that had no equivalent in their own experience. The cantons of the Swiss Confederation were prosperous by the standards of mountain communities, but prosperous by those standards meant enough food through winter, solid construction, equipment maintained and passed down. It did not mean tapestries. It did not mean a travelling library. It did not mean silver instruments whose entire purpose was to communicate social rank through the formality of how a meal was served. The men moving through the camp understood that fine cloth had value and that metal objects could be exchanged for money, and that some of the stones they were finding caught light in unusual ways. What they lacked was the specific cultural knowledge that would have told them exactly how valuable these particular objects were in the world that had assigned them their value. They were holding things whose worth existed inside an agreement they had never been party to. Outside that agreement, the objects were only what they physically were: cloth, metal, stone. The diamond that later tradition connects to this moment enters the historical record in a way that is not entirely clean. The accounts describing what happened to the major jewels of the Burgundian collection after Grandson exist in several versions that do not agree with each other in their details. One account, appearing in sources written after the fact, describes a large diamond associated with Charles being sold by a Swiss soldier to a priest for a price of a few florins, then resold for 3 francs. Another gives different figures. The specific details belong to tradition and retelling rather than the kind of contemporary documentation that historians treat as fully reliable. What the later record shows more clearly, if the traditional identification is accepted, is the subsequent journey of the stone that came to be known as the Sancy Diamond. It appeared in the possession of a king of Portugal, then a king of France. An English monarch used it as security for a loan during a period of financial difficulty. A Russian empress acquired it. Napoleon had it set in the hilt of his sword for his coronation. It entered the Louvre. where it sits today in a case with careful documentation that acknowledges the gaps in its early history. The journey of that stone across 4 centuries is a compressed map of where power lived in Europe. Each owner acquired it because ownership carried meaning within the agreement that powerful people maintained about what was worth owning. Each transfer happened because the previous owner's position within that agreement had changed. The other objects from the grandson camp had their own journeys, most far less documented. The ceremonial silver was almost certainly melted down at some point, because silver in that quantity is too useful to remain indefinitely in a form that carries the identity of a defeated power. The tapestries may have survived longer, since large Flemish textiles of that quality were difficult to destroy quickly, but where they ended up is not reliably recorded. The manuscripts from the travelling library are the most painful loss from any historical perspective. Books do not survive well in the hands of people who do not know what they are holding. The librarian does not appear in the sources covering the aftermath of Grandson. He may have escaped with the retreating army. He may have been among the casualties. What happened to the manuscripts is not recorded in any source that has been found. They appear in the inventories of what the court carried into the field. They are absent from the accounts of what remained afterward. Somewhere between those 2 points, they became something else or nothing at all. That gap in the record is, in miniature, what happened to the Burgundian project as a whole. It was there, documented and substantial and real by every measure available to the people who maintained it. And then it was not there. The space it left filled quickly with other ambitions and other powers making other arguments about who owned the future of Western Europe. Charles was already riding hard away from the field. The objects in the mud could not make the argument anymore. The demonstration had ended at exactly the moment it was most needed. In front of the people least equipped to understand what they were witnessing, and least positioned to assign it the meaning it had carried for 3 generations of Valois dukes. What the men from Uri and Bern and the other cantons saw when they walked through that camp was not the collapse of a political project. They saw cloth and metal and stone, and they made the transactions available to them. They went home with more than they had come with, and with almost no understanding of what the morning had actually cost. The man who had assembled all of it so carefully and carried it so far, that asymmetry between the size of what ended and the smallness of how it ended, is what the field at Grandson looked like in the hours after the battle. Not a monument to anything, not a reckoning visible to the people present, just objects in mud, and men deciding what each one was worth, and the spring light coming across the lake the same way it had come the morning before and the morning before that. There is a particular kind of intelligence that is very good at explaining why things went wrong, without ever arriving at the explanation that requires changing course. It is not stupidity. Stupid people do not construct the elaborate justifications this kind of intelligence produces. It is something more specific. A capacity to process failure through a filter that consistently routes the cause away from the self and toward the circumstances, so that each defeat becomes a lesson about what the world did to you, rather than a lesson about what your own decisions created. The distinction sounds small. Over time, it is the distinction between someone who learns and someone who accumulates increasingly sophisticated explanations for why the learning is not necessary. The surviving record of Charles's decisions in the months after Grandson suggests a man operating this filter with considerable skill. After Grandson, Charles needed to account for what had happened. The army he had spent years and enormous resources building had collapsed in a morning. The treasury he had carried with him was gone. The aura of military invincibility he had cultivated carefully, and that his enemies had taken seriously, was damaged in ways visible across every court in Europe. Louis XI of France, who made it his business to understand the psychology of his opponents with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession, would have read the reports from Grandson with the close attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of information. The accounting Charles constructed, as best as it can be reconstructed from the pattern of his subsequent decisions, located the cause of the defeat in specific contingent factors. The terrain near the lake had not suited cavalry deployment. The Swiss had moved earlier than anticipated, before his formations were ready. The sequence of events on the morning of the 2nd had included elements of bad fortune that a different morning might not have produced. One way to read this pattern is that Charles was doing what intelligent people under pressure often do, selecting the interpretation of failure that preserves the most operational capacity to continue. The machine was fundamentally sound. The circumstances had been against it. Each of these points had some validity. The terrain did present genuine difficulties for the kind of deployment his force required. The timing of the Swiss advance had been a real operational problem. The specific sequence had included contingent elements alongside structural ones. A fair-minded analyst looking at Grandson could identify genuine bad luck alongside genuine systemic failure. The question is not whether those factors existed. The question is what you do with them. You can use contingent factors to understand the limits of your system and adjust accordingly. Or you can use them to explain away the evidence that the system itself has vulnerabilities that adjustment will not fix. The pattern of Charles's behaviour in the months after Grandson points toward the second path. He saw a lesson about timing and terrain rather than a lesson about the nature of the force he was facing and what that force revealed about the structure of his own. He began reassembling his army almost immediately. New recruitment. Replacement of lost equipment. The organisational work of reconstituting a force that had dispersed under pressure. The gendarmes were rebuilt. The same command structures went back into place. The same fundamental assumptions about what his force could do and what the Swiss could not do against it were carried forward unchanged. What came next was Merton. To understand why Charles was at Merton in June of 1476, 3 months after Grandson, you need to understand the geographic logic that drove his entire campaign. Charles's territories were not contiguous. The northern lowlands of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands and the southern Burgundian heartland were connected by a corridor that ran through Lorraine. The duchy that sat between them like a pin holding two pieces of cloth together. Without that corridor, the Burgundian lands were two separate entities that could be challenged and picked apart independently. Keeping the corridor secure meant maintaining pressure on the territories around it, which meant the zone where Swiss influence was most directly in conflict with Burgundian expansion. Merton was a fortified town in this contested zone, held by a Swiss and Allied garrison. Charles moved to besiege it as part of the continuing campaign to consolidate control over the corridor he needed. The Swiss Confederation moved to relieve it. What happened there in June of 1476 was not, Grandson repeated. Grandson had been a collapse, a force that failed to deploy before it came apart. Merton was a destruction. The battle fought there was one of the more complete military defeats of the 15th century. Burgundian losses, by various estimates across the sources of the period, numbered in the thousands. The Swiss pursuit after the battle was prolonged and aggressive. Men who had survived the initial engagement were cut down trying to reach the water. What Charles withdrew with from Merton was the residue of an army rather than an army. The difference between the material and the functional being approximately everything that mattered. The accounting he constructed after Merton was harder to build than the one after Grandson, but the pattern of his subsequent decisions suggests he built it. The position had been poorly chosen. The relief force had moved faster than expected. The circumstances again. The machine was sound. The situation had been against it. He began rebuilding a third time. The men around him saw what was happening with varying degrees of clarity. Some of his commanders had views about what needed to change, and some of those views survive in the record with a directness that suggests the people holding them understood the situation considerably better than the decisions being made around them reflected. The structural difficulty was that Charles had built a system in which dissent from his conclusions was not productively incorporated. He rewarded the competent execution of his plans and found other explanations for why the plans had not worked, which is a configuration that makes plans very well executed and very resistant to revision. By the autumn of 1476, the political landscape was deteriorating in ways connected to, but not entirely caused by, the military defeats. The aura of Burgundian invincibility that had made allies stay aligned and potential enemies stay cautious was gone. Without it, the calculations of every power in the region began to shift. Louis XI had been working in his characteristic way, applying money and patience and diplomacy to the problem of ensuring Charles faced complications on every side simultaneously. The options available to Charles were narrowing in ways that a year earlier would have seemed unlikely. He moved toward Nancy, the capital of the Duchy of Lorraine, the pin that held the Burgundian territories together. Taking Nancy would not undo Grandson or Merton, but it would demonstrate that the project was still viable, that the defeats had been interruptions rather than a verdict. The battle at Nancy happened on the 5th of January, 1477. Charles had a force significantly smaller than what he had commanded at Grandson. Depleted by 2 major defeats and the defections and reorganizations of the intervening months, against him was a combined force of Lorrainers and Swiss, fighting in winter conditions on ground that again did not favour the kind of cavalry deployment that would have made his remaining heavy horse effective. The battle did not last long. Charles was killed at Nancy. His body was not found immediately, in the disorder that follows any military collapse. The location of a commander becomes uncertain quickly, and Charles had not encouraged planning for the contingency of his own death, because that planning would have required acknowledging the possibility. He was missing for days. When his body was found, it was near a body of frozen water some distance from the main field of battle. His face was unrecognizable. He was identified through physical characteristics known to his attendants. Old wounds and marks that survived where other identifying features did not. The man who had employed a master of ceremonies to ensure every greeting communicated exactly the right thing about who he was ended up being identified by his scars. The project of an independent Burgundian power ended at Nancy. Not in a treaty or a formal acknowledgement, but in the way things end, when the person holding them together is no longer there to hold them. His daughter Mary inherited the territories. Through her marriage to Maximilian of Habsburg, they passed into the Habsburg inheritance that would shape European politics for the following 2 centuries. The lands continued. The specific thing Charles had wanted. The independent crown, the name on the map that required no footnote, died with him in that frozen field on the 5th of January, 1477. He had had opportunities to learn what the Swiss were trying to teach him. Héricourt in 1474, Grandson in 1476, Merton 3 months after that. Each time the lesson was the same. Each time the pattern of his subsequent decisions suggests he heard something else entirely. At Nancy, there was no subsequent decision available. News moved slowly in the 15th century by modern standards. By the standards of its own time, military information of strategic significance moved with considerable efficiency along the diplomatic networks connecting the major courts of Europe. The courts of France, the Italian states, the Habsburg territories, and the various powers of the empire maintained information networks precisely because knowing what had happened elsewhere, before your neighbours knew it was one of the primary currencies of political power, the shape of what had happened at Grandson reached those courts within weeks, stripped of local detail. What it communicated to anyone who spent their working life thinking about military power was specific and legible. The most professionally organised army in the region had met Swiss pike formations in open field and collapsed without mounting an effective defence. The force that military planners across Europe had been treating as the benchmark of what a modern professional army could achieve had been broken by a force that did not fit the benchmark at all. And this was the second time. The same result had occurred at Héricourt 2 years earlier. 2 data points. Same opponent. Same basic outcome. The people processing this information in courts and counting houses were not doing so out of historical curiosity. They were asking a practical question. Not about justice or the surprising reversals that history occasionally delivers, but about what to do with the information they now had. Consider a senior official in Milan receiving reports from Grandson in the spring of 1476. Milan was a state that fought wars and needed soldiers to fight them, and spent considerable resources on military procurement. The Sforza Duchy was engaged in the complicated multiplayer competition for influence in the Italian peninsula that required maintaining military options credible enough to deter intervention and effective enough to act on when. Deterrence failed. What Grandson told him was that a military force existed, within hiring distance, that had just demonstrated something in the most convincing possible way. The demonstration had been performed against the best available opponent, under conditions that were not artificially favourable, with an outcome that left no reasonable room for treating the result as an anomaly. He would not have asked who the Swiss were. They were already known. He would have asked what it cost to hire them, under what terms, and how quickly an arrangement could be formalised. That question, multiplied across a dozen courts simultaneously, is what reshaped European military economics in the decades after Grandson. France moved aggressively. Louis XI had been watching Swiss military development with informed interest for years, and his response to the Burgundian Wars was to accelerate existing relationships and develop new ones. The terms on which the Swiss negotiated their services reflected their new market position directly. They knew what had just been demonstrated. The people offering contracts knew what had just been demonstrated. The price adjusted accordingly. Venice followed. Venice maintained one of the more sophisticated military procurement operations in Europe. Built on decades of managing a maritime empire with continental commitments that required a reliable supply of land forces, Swiss contracts fit into an existing framework, and Grandson provided the operational evidence that made the evaluation straightforward. The papacy reached the same conclusion through its own specific logic. The Pontifical Swiss Guard, established formally in 1506 when Pope Julius II invited 150 soldiers from the canton of Uri to Rome, was the institutional expression of a relationship between Swiss military service and Italian employers that had been developing for decades. Julius II needed soldiers organisationally independent from Italian factional politics in an environment where the dangers to the papacy were as likely to come from within the city as from outside it. Swiss soldiers, carrying a reputation built on actual field performance, answered that specific need. The Swiss Guard that stands in Vatican City today is the most visible living remainder of the transformation that Grandson helped accelerate. When you see that image, you are looking at the long institutional tale of a morning in 1476, when a pike formation came out of a forest at an unexpected hour, and the most expensive army in the region did not have time to form up. There is an irony embedded in this sequence that deserves to be named directly. The demand that made Swiss military service so valuable after 1476 was created in significant part by the execution at Grandson, by Charles's decision to kill 412 men after they surrendered. That decision had activated the response that produced the demonstration that remade the market. The action Charles took to establish dominance had directly contributed to creating the force that destroyed him, and then reshaped how European states thought about military power for the following half-century. History produces this kind of structural irony with some regularity. The action intended to secure the position creates the condition that ends it. It is nearly impossible to see from inside the logic of your own decisions, because from inside that logic the action appears entirely reasonable. It becomes visible only from outside, only later, only when the full sequence can be traced without the distortions that proximity and pressure create. Charles could not see it. He was inside it. Europe learned very quickly how to use what the Swiss had demonstrated at Grandson. What it did not do, and what the following centuries would confirm, was learn to remember the demonstration itself. The market that opened after 1476 proved far more durable than the memory of the morning that opened it. Power moved on. The story did not travel with it. Ask someone in Switzerland about Grandson, and you will find recognition. The battle is embedded in the national historical memory in a way that is genuine and durable. Taught in schools, present in the cultural landscape of the region where it happened. The Swiss know what happened on the 2nd of March, 1476, and they know what it meant. Ask someone in the United States. Ask someone in England. Ask someone in France. Where the consequences of the Burgundian Wars shaped the military and political calculations of Louis XI for the remainder of his reign. Ask someone in Italy, where the demand for Swiss soldiers that Grandson helped create altered the outcomes of wars that determined which families controlled which cities for generations. The answer you will almost certainly receive is either a blank expression or a polite admission that the name means nothing. This is not because Grandson was a minor event. The sequence running from Grandson through Merton to Nancy and the death of Charles was one of the more significant political ruptures in 15th century European history. It ended the Burgundian project that had been reshaping the political geography of Western Europe for 3 generations. It demonstrated the operational limits of the most advanced military model available at the time. It accelerated a transformation in how European states procured military force that persisted for more than a century. It removed from the board a player whose survival would have significantly constrained the options available to France. The Habsburgs, and every smaller power trying to navigate between them. These are not small things, and yet Grandson is not in the story most of the world tells about the 15th century. The gap between historical consequence and cultural memory is one of the more instructive puzzles the past offers. It is tempting to assume that the events which mattered most are the ones that survive best in collective memory. That time acts as a filter selecting for importance. The actual mechanism works almost in the opposite direction. Time selects for the stories that had powerful and motivated advocates. It discards the stories whose potential advocates were not positioned to tell them effectively. Grandson did not have powerful advocates in the sense that matters for long-term cultural memory. Think about what produces a battle that survives across centuries into the awareness of people with no particular reason to know about it. Thermopylae is remembered because the Greeks who came after possessed both the literary culture and the political motivation to transform a tactical defeat into a foundational myth. The loss was made into something more culturally useful than a victory would have been. A story about what Greeks were, about the values that justified their civilization. Herodotus wrote about it. Simonides wrote the epitaph that still circulates. The story was actively tended by people with both the skill and the institutional position to make it last across generations. Agincourt survives in the English-speaking world partly because of what happened, and partly because of a play written more than a century and a half after the battle. William Shakespeare transformed a significant English military victory into one of the defining articulations of English national character, without the specific form his language gave it. Agincourt would be a significant entry in military histories of the 100 Years' War, rather than a phrase that English speakers reach for when they want to invoke the image of the outnumbered and determined standing against the overwhelming. Grandson had neither of these conditions working in its favour. Charles was dead within a year of the battle, which meant the potential audience for a heroic Burgundian narrative had no institutional centre around which to organise. The Burgundian court that might have commissioned the paintings and chronicles through which events become permanent cultural memories was dissolved and dispersed. The territories passed to Mary and through her to the Habsburgs, whose interest in the Burgundian past was instrumental rather than commemorative. They wanted the lands and the administrative structures. They were considerably less interested in the story of how the man who had assembled those lands died unrecognised near a frozen stream outside Nancy. The Swiss presented a different kind of problem for memory making. This is not a criticism of Swiss culture. It is an observation about a specific difference. The Swiss cantons did not operate the kind of court culture that produced the court poets and centralised programmes of commemoration through which military victories are transformed into stories accessible to people far removed from the original events. They had chronicles. They had local records and oral traditions that kept the memory alive within the communities where the men who fought came from. They did not have the institutional machinery for projecting that memory outward, across linguistic and cultural boundaries, in a form durable enough to survive into the awareness of people with no prior connection to it. There is also the problem of narrative shape. The battles that achieve lasting cultural memory tend to have a structure that can be extracted from their historical context and carried into other conversations. Thermopylae works as a portable story because its shape is universally legible. A small force stands against an overwhelming enemy, knowing the outcome, because the alternative is worse. The shape is clean and the meaning travels. Grandson does not travel the same way. The Swiss won. The victory was real and the consequences were significant. But there is no last stand. No beautiful defeat. No single figure whose sacrifice can be mourned by people arriving at the story with no prior knowledge. There is a formation that emerged from a forest at an unexpected hour and broke an army that was not ready. That outcome is deeply satisfying if you understand the full context. It does not carry itself across 6 centuries to people encountering it for the first time. Grandson did not fail to matter. It failed to find advocates with both the interest and the capacity to make it matter to people who were not already there. That failure is not unusual. It is the normal condition of most of what happens. The events that shape the world are vastly more numerous than the events that shape the story of the world. And the relationship between those two sets is determined by factors that have very little to do with importance. Who was watching? Who could write? Who had the institutional support to keep writing? Who had an audience that needed the story to be true? Grandson cracked the aura that Merton then shattered and Nancy then made permanent. It proved that the machine could be broken. It showed every court in Europe that the force everyone had been treating as the benchmark had a specific and exploitable weakness. It did the first and most dangerous thing. which is make the ending imaginable, and then nobody turned that moment into a story that could travel. The Swiss went home. Charles ran. The objects were sold in a field. The world moved on, carrying the consequences of what had happened without carrying the account of how those consequences came to be. This is how most of history actually works. Not as a sequence of memorable stories, but as a sequence of events, most of which are forgotten almost immediately, whose effects persist long after the memory is gone. The forgetting is the rule. The remembering is the exception that requires explanation. Grandson is the rule. And understanding why it was forgotten teaches you something about how the exceptions work that you cannot learn from the exceptions themselves. The Sancy diamond is in Paris. It sits in the Apollo Gallery of the Louvre, in a case with other stones and objects from the French crown collection. And you can go and look at it today. You can buy a ticket, walk through the museum, find the Apollo Gallery, and stand in front of the case and look at a pale yellow stone of unusual size and clarity that has been in more places and passed through more hands than almost any comparable object in European history. The label near the stone describes its known provenance with the measured care that good museum documentation applies when the record is incomplete. It acknowledges what is documented and uses appropriately cautious language for the portions of the story that exist in tradition, rather than verified records. It does not tell you everything, because everything is not fully known. What it does not say prominently enough for most visitors to leave understanding is that the early history of this stone may include a muddy field in western Switzerland in the spring of 1476, and a man who did not understand what he was holding, and a transaction conducted at a price that would become one of the more quietly devastating footnotes in the history of objects that outlasted the worlds that created them. If the old tradition connecting the Sancy to grandson is right, the stone in that case is not just a jewel, it is the last polished fragment of a world that broke beside Lake Neuchâtel on a morning in early March. Think about the journey that stone may have made, from a battlefield to a priest to a king of Portugal to a king of France to an English monarch who needed money to a Russian empress who wanted symbols of power to the hilt of Napoleon's coronation sword, and finally into a case in a museum where the lighting is careful and the documentation is honest about what it does not know. Every owner understood what they were acquiring. Every transfer happened because the world in which the stone carried meaning had shifted in ways that made its previous owner unable to hold it or unwilling to keep it. The stone itself changed nothing. It carried the light the way it always carried the light, indifferent to the hands it passed through and the meanings they assigned to it, waiting with the patience of carbon for whatever came next. There are 412 men who held a fortress and were killed after they surrendered, whose names are not in the museum. There is a formation of soldiers who walked down from their cantons in winter because the Confederation had called, and because the alternative to walking down was to stop being themselves, whose names are not in the museum. There is a man who built something extraordinary across 3 decades and could not learn from what broke it. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, whose name appears in the museum only in connection with the object he lost. Charles bought an army to build a kingdom. The Swiss bought nothing. They stood next to each other and held the formation because the person beside them was the person beside them. And that turned out to be a more durable foundation than anything money could construct or ceremony could declare. The kingdom is gone. The army is gone. The man is gone. The stone is in Paris. The guard is in Rome. And if you stand in front of that case in the Apollo Gallery and you know the shape of the story the stone may be carrying, the morning and the mud and the man who did not know what he was holding and the price that seemed fair, then you are looking at what history mostly is. Not the grand narrative, not the celebrated battles and the remembered names, the thing left behind when everything else was taken or lost or forgotten, the weight of what happened, sitting in a case, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Most people walk past,